So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled The Novel and Change. We're looking at Akin Narayan's novel, The Guide. So from this particular session, we will start with a macro reading of the guide in terms of how it is reflective of the cultural conditions of its times. Because as you remember, the principal theory, the principal philosophical framework of this course is to look at the relationship between text and context. And the book you're reading, we are drawing on, is Faiza Afzal Khan's Cultural Imperialism and the Indian English Novel. So again, if you look at the title of the book, Faiza Afzal Khan, Cultural Imperialism and the Indian English Novel, which is to say how the cultural capital, how the entire cultural geography is invested and embedded in the production and consumption of the Indian English novel. And in particular, of course, we will study the role and relevance of Akin Narayan. Now, on your screen, the title of this particular chapter is The Realm of Mythic Realism. Now, it sounds a bit oxymoronic, like magic realism, but that's exactly the point, because there is a really interesting combination between the myth and contemporary materiality, as we have discussed already in Narayan's writing. So we have a lot of resurrection and recreation and reconstruction of ancient myths, ancient Indian myths, which are retooled and resituated in contemporary context. We see that happening in the guide throughout. So this particular chapter will give us a more macro view in terms of how this informs Narayan's writing in general, and of course to guide in particular. So just let's dive in. The works of Akin Narayan, who combines Indian myth with critical realism in his serious comedies, reveal their ideological implications quite clearly. So, as you can see from the very first sentence, it talks about the production of paradoxes or the productive paradoxes in Narayan's writing. The whole idea of serious comedy, for instance, there is a sort of satirical quality to these comedies, which also contain very relevant and quite profound social scenarios and messages. But they also expose or reveal the ideological implications, the ideological positions somewhere these kind of writing is produced. As William Walsh, in his book Akin Narayan, A Critical Appreciation, points out, and there's a quotation from Walsh, the reader will have felt the effects of the principle which orders the pattern and affects the structure of Narayan's fiction, namely that of balance. This is the principle of the greatest significance in novels, which are comedies of sadness, works in which the material and attitudes appropriate to different genres flow in and out of one another, right? So there is this really interesting and complexly carnivalesque quality in Narayan's writing, which is why all these seemingly oxymoronic terms are used. Comedies of sadness, for instance, genres flowing in and flowing out. So what appeared to be conflicting, or appeared to be sort of contributory to each other in other works, seem to be sort of creating some kind of a structure of supplementarity in Narayan's fiction. And this structure of supplementarity or structures of supplementarity are really interesting because this is exactly how he blends together ancientness and newness, an ancient civilization and the aspirations and anxieties of a new nation, right? So there is this idea, we discussed it already, how there is a sort of immutable, unchanging civilizational solidity, which is something that Narayan's writing is plucked into. But at the same time, there is this very mutable, metropolitan, anxious, insecure identity formations which are happening and which get produced in the new economy of the new nation, right? So this contradiction as well as supplementarity are important for us to underscore. In other words, there is a balancing of various genres in Narayan's novels, a harmonious coexistence symbolizing a unity, a wholeness, towards which Narayan's protagonists are constantly progressing and which they must achieve if they are to mature fully, right? So there's a sense of wholeness and harmony that is aspired for. Now, of course, what we see is the wholeness that Narayan has in mind or Narayan creates through his characters is something which sometimes becomes almost non-persuadable or not achievable in a strict sense of the term. There's a constantly slippery, elusive quality about that concept. The wholeness, which, as I will show later, becomes a hollowness for Salman Rushdie, the most modern of the four novelists to be considered, is possible in the Malgudi of Narayan's novels because it is a world rooted in Indian myth and tradition, a town that is still pastoral in its innocence of the political reality of modern 20th century India. So again, the whole idea of the pastoral and the metropolitan and how the slow and sudden changes that take place. For instance, the most dramatic one in the guide is the arrival of railways, which really changes a sleepy little town into some kind of an episodic, volatile center of movements coming in and coming out. This becomes a liminal territory, if you will, where space-time becomes episodic, experiences become episodic, fractured in different points of time, right? So there is that transformative quality in the landscapes in space-time, which is also represented and calibrated in Narayan's writings. And this is, of course, the very interesting and complex picture of 20th century India, which is still plucked into ancientness in many ways. It's still plucked into very old values, but at the same time, it is also looking forward. The orientation is also forward-looking in its anxieties, insecurities, aspirations of more modern India, right? So it is clear that Malgudi, although a small region, is a place of ancient myth and history, which Narayan does not choose to re-examine, right? So there is a sort of immutability about Malgudi, the chronotop, which is laminated in space-time, which doesn't change, which is still very heavily plucked into the old myths, the old value orders, etc. Here, what matters most is not how the natives deal with the aftermath of political fragmentation, but whether they will achieve an authentic and sincere identity as Indians in an inauthentic Indian setting. Now, there is a sense of this is what I mean by anxiety. So whether at all the identities, the characters in Narayan's fiction will ever achieve authenticity, or can authenticity only be achieved through the inauthentic methods? Now, this should remind us of the last image, or the last bit in Narayan's guide, where Raju's orientation towards sainthood is never really clear, whether it's a sincere sainthood or it's some kind of a charlatan showman idea of the saintliness, where he's performing it in a very superficial way. The novel really doesn't make it clear. It is very inconclusive in that sense. And we talked about the inconclusivity as a narrative category in Narayan's fiction. Now, the issue of authenticity is tied closely to that of sincerity. We just talked about sincerity right now, which can be achieved only through the growth of self and social awareness. And most of Narayan's protagonists are able to achieve some measure of both. So there is a sense of social awareness, self-awareness. We studied earlier how the biological growth of Raju and the sort of the osmosis through which he acquires social awareness, they go hand in hand. So that sense is a Bildungsroman in the proper sense of the word, except that towards the end it becomes more complicated, where Railway Raju becomes a tourist guide, from which he becomes a lover of a married woman, and from that he becomes the manager of an artist, and then of course he becomes some kind of a fraud guy who gets arrested for forging signatures, and then he ends up supposedly as a saint. So that supposedly here being the operative word. Now, here it is important to understand, or underscore rather, how what is called mythic realism in this particular essay is different, is comparable as well as different, contrary to the classic realism that we find in Western novelistic traditions. For instance, Robinson Crusoe, Jane Eyre, and then works of Jane Austen, right? So the goal of Western realism, as seen in Jane Austen's novels, for example, is for the individuals to achieve a state of balance between individual autonomy and social responsibility. So there is that desired balance which is there, the equilibrium, if you will, between autonomy and collectivity, between individuality and collective identity. Of course, through accountability, responsibility, and so on and so forth. Neither extreme being viewed as good. And this is usually achieved through becoming honest or sincere about oneself and one's motives, which in turn leads to sincerity and responsibility towards others, right? So there's a sense of altruism, empathy, which are produced due to true forms of sincerity. And this is where the Western realism seems to be plugged into. Now, what this aims to achieve at a level of characterization is consistency of character, right? So whether it's a good character or a bad character, the illusion of consistency or the construction of consistency is important to different plot patterns, to different forms of employment. Now, although such authenticity of character and maturity are achieved primarily in the Western realist mode in Narayan's work, the part played by the Indian mythical and mystical tradition in achieving these desired ends cannot be underestimated. So there is again the really magnificent ambivalence in Narayan's fiction, where on the one hand he's obviously at the level of craft is very heavily plugged into the Western realist tradition, but at the same time he's also drawing on quite extensively, one would argue, on the Indian mythical tradition. So there is this mythic method that Narayan uses, quite similar to Joyce's mythic method that Eliot talks about in Ulysses and other works. And there is also, of course, the realism that he borrows from the Western tradition. So there's a sometimes uneasy and sometimes seamless interplay of these different traditions. Narayan, it seems, cannot get away from mythification because it is through the use of Indian myth that some measure of an authentic Indian past can be recreated. So it's only through the mythic method that the authentic Indian past can be recreated, retold. So again, through a ludic, performative quality. However, it should be clear at the outset that the petrifying effects of myth are not always offset by the balancing effects of realism. Right. So this is something which you talked about already earlier, that how the fundamental framework of Narayan's writing is deconstructive in quality, right? So it's not really one of dualisms, but rather of deconstruction, where the newness and the ancientness, where the realism and the mythical quality are not really undercutting each other. So not all of Narayan's protagonists choose to respond to the call of social and familial duty, or to the demands and pressures of real life, right? So I know some of them choose to respond differently to the pressures of real life or the escapist qualities of certain forms of spirituality. They're very individual that way, which is why we still tend to remember Narayan's characters as characters of flesh and blood. They're quite organic in the individuality, in the differences, in the different forms of acceptance and rejection. Some, like Krishna in The English Teacher and Jagan in The Vendor of Sweets, choose to retreat from the pressures of social living into a world of mysticism and myth. In other words, they choose against maturity and sincerity in the realist mode, although they may achieve some authenticity and wisdom within the mode of myth, right? So there is realism, there is myth. So there are certain characters which gravitate more towards myth, there are certain characters which gravitate more towards realism, but it's always an entanglement, right? That's the process of shading, as it were, which has been talked about over here. It's not really a monolithic, oppositional play. So thus, it is important to remember that there are contradictions to be found in Narayan's works, happy contradictions or productive paradoxes, symbolic of the inherently confusing situation in which the Indo-English, or for the matter, any post-colonial writer finds him or herself. So this confusion, this intellectual confusion, this artistic confusion is very typical of any post-colonial production process, where there's this anxiety to still remain faithful to the indigenous myths, but at the same time, there is this sort of navigation to the new methods of storytelling, more often than not, to the Western model of classical realism. Yet, by and large, the pattern of Narayan's novels is one that, according to one critic, gives us the account of an enveloping or evolving consciousness beginning in isolation and confusion and ending in wholeness. So there is a sense of moving towards wholeness that we see, an approximation of wholeness. Now, the important word here is approximation, because with approximation is connected the idea of performativity. So the fact that Narayan makes Raju, the protagonist and the guide, approximate sainthood, perform sainthood, also means that yes, there is proximity towards that category, but also there's some kind of a liminal gap between the real saint and what Raju ends up becoming. So we don't quite know, as we have discussed already, whether or not Raju actually becomes a saint, whether he actually manages to bring the rain, because we just have to take his words in the end that he can feel the rain coming up his feet, right? And that's it. The novel ends there, right? So, in other words, the demands of the mythic and realist modes often coalesce, so they blend together. And in responding to those demands, the protagonist often achieves a balance of both. So there's this asymmetric entanglement between the mythical method and the material method, between the mystic realism and the real realism. So these two categories keep blending in Narayan's novels. Okay. So there is a discussion on another novel, The Bachelor of Arts, which we'll not read because that's not something we are studying at the moment, but we can sort of skip through it and come to another important aspect of Narayan's writings, which is to say his dealing and engagement with ambivalent articulations, right? The idea of, someone who is still drawing on, someone who is still shaped by the civilizational ethos of India, but at the same time is a mobile subject, is an aspirational subject, moving across different urban coordinates, and so on and so forth. So, so there is this should be on the screen, this theme of the reversal of cause and effect, of someone becoming sincere, although being insincere, is a paradox that delights Narayan and is central to his ironic vision of life. So this is a really important bit, the ironic vision of life. So all identities iterated in Narayan's fiction are ironic in quality. The ironic iterations or ironic identities, where paradoxes become connected, paradoxes become productive. There's a sort of reversal of cause and effect, as it were. And insincerity can only be achieved, or sincerity can only be achieved through insincerity, right? So there is that productive paradox at play. So the same pattern is repeated in many of his other books, most prominently in The Guide. So that's obviously a novel we're reading specifically, but that's something which occurs in other books as well. So in The Guide, in which the protagonist Raju begins by playing a role, but ends up assuming it for real. Although such a reversal rarely implies self-transformation, it does lead to self-discovery, as is obvious in Chandran's case. So either the self-transformation or self-discovery, either through an accident or through a liminal passage. So these things are very familiar tropes in Narayan's writings. Now, what is interesting to note is that such a reversal leading to self-discovery and a measure of authenticity and sincerity occurs often in a state of mystical withdrawal. So mysticism over here is not seen as something strictly escapist in quality, strictly confusing in quality, but rather mysticism, it seems to give light, give a sense of clarity, empirical clarity, logical clarity to a problem at hand. So again, what we're looking at here is not looking at or not examining mysticism and rationality as oppositional categories, but rather mysticism is something which lends itself to reason and makes it a more holistic vision. So George Woodcock, in an article on Narayan, sheds some light on the implications of such a withdrawal. And as a quote from Woodcock, can a modern Indian reject westernization with its political and ultimately moral implications? The only way to attempt it, Narayan suggests, is by withdrawal into one of two Indian worlds that remained relatively untouched by the intrusion of the Raj. These are the interlocking worlds of villages, still living largely by traditional techniques as well as beliefs, and of the wandering holy men. In Narayan's novel, such withdrawal rarely provides a way to self-transformation, but it does often lead to self-discovery. Now, there is this idea of untouched by the original sin, untouched by the crime of the Raj, the crime of the empire, so to speak. So the villages in Narayan's fiction, the rural landscapes in Narayan's fiction appears to be untouched, appears to be non-contaminated by the evils and excesses of imperialism. So that becomes then, a way, of self-transformation. It's also a way to process self-discovery. So although the outcome of such a withdrawal is often an awakening in the protagonist of a scene of sense of sincerity to himself, leading to sincerity and responsible behavior towards others, in which is the ultimate aim of goal of realism, such an attitude in Narayan's work generally results from the symbolic immersion in the rituals of Hindu mysticism and mythic beliefs. So there is, as I mentioned, that Narayan seems to have a lot of sympathy of certain Indian beliefs and myths, and there's a sense of immersion, sense of description, immersion, engagement, empathy at a cognitive, emotional level that his characters seem to be exhibiting, right? So the word immersion here is important. So we talk about Chandran, who's a character from another novel as well, but we'll skip a little bit of that and we'll come to the great um, the guide, and there is a reference to a dark room, which again is quite political in itself, and the same structures of confinement and coercion are taking place, right? And confinement, as in, is coming from certain power structures, from certain erstwhile protocols, this coercion from certain residual patriarchal orders. But at the same time, there's liberation, there's an opening up of the market, opening up of the moral vocabulary, the value vocabulary, and so on and so forth, right? So when we say market and economy in Narayan's writing, we're not just talking about market and economy in the financial self. There's also the moral market, the moral economy, and how and what happens to that in a very quickly changing India, where the urban centers become more important. The urban centers become the sort of centripetal points where identities are iterated. So there are references to English teacher, the references to early Narayan's writing as well, but we'll move on to the guide because that is the novel we're reading, and that in some sense is perhaps Narayan's best work, right? So the very title, as I suggested earlier, is an allusion to the Hindu Indian teacher tradition, right? But that is something which is quickly frustrated, and in the end, the novel becomes some kind of just a parody, not just a parody of the sort of spiritual guru culture, but also a sense of self-realization, where Raju, the protagonist, is increasingly deflating away from his earlier achievements and ambitions, and so on and so forth. Right. So we'll come to the guide now, and we will see how the guide becomes almost some kind of a centerpiece to Narayan's fiction, because it is that novel which really gave him the most fame. It was made into a film, as I mentioned, starring Dev Anand, which Narayan wasn't particularly happy about or really appreciative of. But the fact that it lent itself to another medium is important for us to understand. Okay. And there's a reference to Financial Expert. There's a reference to a whole host of other novels in this particular essay. But just to give you a sense of what the essay is saying, and also elsewhere that we've studied so far, is how there is a sense of ambivalence, carnivalesque comedy, gallows humor, dark humor. All that is there in Narayan's fiction, because there's a sort of tongue-in-cheek style of communicating comedy. But also there are instances where there's slapstick. There are instances where there are comedies by accident, and they all get woven in Narayan's fiction because it incorporates a complex sentimental structure, a complex emotional structure. It's never really monolithic or static, but rather something which is always mutable and always subject to change, vulnerability, embellishment, amplitude, and so on and so forth. So we stop at this point today, and hopefully this essay is beginning to give you some of the macro conditions in which Narayan's writing is emerging from, and we'll continue and hopefully finish this section in the subsequent session. Thank you for your attention.